A very common mindset that we have and that's cultivated in our society is either or thinking. So when you are thinking in terms of us and them, I think that can just lead to a dismissal because you have generalized about another group as if there are two groups. And when we have an us and them mindset, that impedes a solutionary mindset because a solutionary mindset is willing to hear a variety of perspectives, wants the nuance, wants to hear from stakeholders, both who are impacted by problems and who benefit. It's really important to understand all of these factors and then say, okay, we can solve this. And that's where the solutionary mindset comes in.
Hello and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, where we dive into ideas that can change the future for each of us as individuals, and we meet innovators who are changing the future for all of us. We are going to meet an amazing guest today who is a part of this enormous wave of goodness and progress that I keep harping about. Have you ever felt like you wanted to make a difference in the world, but you just didn't know how to get started? Maybe you're saying to yourself, somebody's got to do something about that. About anything that you normally run into routinely. Well, Zoe Weil has the answer for us. She's got a concept where she helps us become solutionaries in our family, in our neighborhood, in our communities, and she's written a powerful book called The Solutionary Way. So, exactly what is a solutionary? Well, the way I understand it, and of course Zoe is going to go into it much deeper, but it's like someone who sees a problem as an opportunity and then takes action to make things better. Whether it's like advocating for social justice or volunteering for something that needs help in your community or promoting kindness or compassion, maybe it's doing something large or small for the environment. Solutionaries are the driving force behind change in our world these days. And there is a method of becoming one. If you don't start out being one of those folks who just knows what to do next all the time when you see a problem, well, Zoe Weil is here to help us with that. And here's the really exciting part. This concept is not for people with special influence. We can all become solutionaries. With Zoe's principles and the mindset she teaches us and the one she shares with us today, we can unlock our own potential and live lives of purpose and so much joy. We will give you a transformative perspective on what to do next and how to become one of those people who changes the future for everyone. Okay, so welcome, Zoe Weil.
Thank you so much, Linda. It is such a pleasure to be on your show again and to see you. And I'm just so grateful for all the great work you do.
All right. Well, I know I don't nearly appreciate the definition of a solutionary yet, but I think it's even more expansive. And oh, geez, I just got goosebumps thinking about it. I think it's even better than I described it. So let's do two things. Let's get to that description really quick. But I want to start with something that you opened the book with that I just loved, and I think we can slide into a better definition of solutionaries. You said in the very opening of the book, we are the flood and we are the ark. Start us off with why you chose that to open the book and how it relates to what you think about the solutionary way.
So that's a quote from Jonathan Safran Foer, and I find that quote deeply resonant with how I perceive the world. The world is full of problems that we have caused, and the world can be full of solutions that we create. So this idea that we are both the flood and the ark is just, it's fundamentally true. And I thought it was such a poetic way that he said it that I put it as the opening quote of the book.
It relates to a finer point on the definition of a solutionary. If you ask me, like I mentioned volunteering in your introduction, but that's not always like there's a better definition there. Talk to us about the how you think of the solutionary way and how it relates to volunteering.
So, sure. Well, the word solutionary is a made up word. Why do we need a made up word to describe this thing, this action, this person? And it's because a solutionary is not the same as a problem solver. So, the definition of a solutionary that we use is somebody who can identify problems and identify unjust, unsustainable systems, and then transform them in ways that do the most good and the least harm for everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean people and animals and the environment. So, what you can hear in that is there is an ethical component to being a solutionary. So, an engineer can solve the problem of damming a river or blowing up a mountain for coal removal, but they are not solutionaries because they're missing that ethical component. Now, a solutionary is also not the same thing as a humanitarian. So, you could volunteer to do a beach cleanup, which would be a wonderful thing to do, but tomorrow and next week and next month, there's going to be more trash on that beach. A solutionary is looking for the root and systemic causes of the problem to solve that problem so it no longer persists. So that's why there's this made up word, because it's really describing something that goes beyond humanitarianism and it goes beyond problem solving.
That is an important distinction, right? Like, and maybe that's why the world of quick fixes doesn't quite feel so satisfying, you know? We can go out, and I'm not dissing Earth Day or green ups or anything. We need to be out there this Saturday. We're going to be cleaning our road in our huge neighborhood and filling, bags with trash. But what you're talking about is a higher level of thought process. Like, how do we keep this from happening in the first place, right?
Yes. Yeah. And again, like we need humanitarians. When there's suffering, when there's destruction, we need to help. But if we're only humanitarians, if we're only cleaning up the road once a year, well, we're not solving the problems that we need to solve so that people aren't suffering and we're not seeing the destruction around us.
Right, right, right. Okay. So by the time this podcast airs, it'll be about 4 days after the book comes out. And you and I both know how that works, but I'm not sure the ordinary person does. I didn't before I started doing the goodness exchange. You know, what rises to the top is what's rising to the top. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. In our news cycles, in what gets to be called a New York Times bestseller, one of the real takeaways I want from this interview is that people will order and dive into this book because it's a path. It's a transformational path. I was familiar with your work. I'll give people the show notes and links, and that's one of the reasons why I'm taking all these good notes. Is that we will make show notes on the Goodness Exchange about everything you and I talk about in this interview, and I'm sure we'll mention books and videos and people and all kinds of solutionaries that you want to make us aware of. And so you can go directly to the Goodness Exchange and find all the links that Zoe and I talk about today. But let's start there with the book. It's coming out on June 25th, and it's called The Solutionary Way, and it's a bit of a big picture version of something you're rather famous for. I've interviewed you first. Episode 91 on the Goodness Exchange Conspiracy of Goodness podcast is with you and your executive director, Steve Cochran, about the application of this concept in education. And I think what I understand is that you realize that, it's important to teach this is a way of going forward for all of society, not just something we should teach kids.
Right. So our work at the Institute for Humane Education is really to transform the education system and to prepare the leaders in education so that we are educating a generation of solutionaries. So young people are learning literacy, numeracy, the scientific method, and they're also gaining critical and systems and strategic and creative thinking skills, and they're applying all of that to real world problems that they care about. And the impacts on young people, on their communities, on their schools is really quite profound. So that's the long game. I believe that the education system is the root system that underlies all other societal systems. And unless we transform that system in these ways, we're going to see problems continue and continue and continue. But if we educate a generation of solutionaries, they're going to grow up to enter professions and have careers where they have a solutionary mindset, and they transform the systems within their profession in ways that really do the most good and the least harm. So that's our theory of action. I've been doing that for a very, very long time. At the same time, the problems that we are facing are they're with us right now, and we can't just wait for a generation of solutionaries. We need everybody to become a solutionary, or at least if not everybody, we need a critical mass of solutionaries. And we are seeing so many problems in our communities, in our society, in our nation, in our world. We are polarized, we are divided, we are struggling to have solutions that we can implement. So I wrote this book for anybody who is concerned about any problem. And it could be a problem in their own life, or it could be a problem in their community, or in their state, or in their country, or in the world. And this book will help any individual who cares have a path toward becoming a collaborative, positive problem solver or
Right.
solutionary, and ethical solutionary.
Well, yeah. Talk to us about. There was a great point. It's on down in my questions somewhere, but we might as well talk about it now because you've mentioned it twice. There's this there's this ethical part
Yeah.
of the equation here, that often kind of gets mixed up with what we're arguing about on school boards, that kind of ethics, and what we're arguing about how far back to take the problem of, let's say, politics or the environment or whatever. Talk to us about, you've got an interesting window on the ethical part of this whole equation.
So, one of the things that distinguishes our work and being a solutionary is taking into consideration everyone. And I said before, when we say everyone, we mean people, animals, and the environment. So, even if our focus is on a human rights issue, or an environmental issue, or an animal protection issue, whatever solutions that we come up with, we have to be asking ourselves, what are the impacts and the potential unintended negative consequences of my solution on another group, even if that group is not my primary focus? Because we're all in this together. We all share this planet. And one of the challenges with coming up with solutions in a globalized world where we have so many complex interconnected systems is that there can be serious unintended negative consequences of our ideas if we are not paying attention to all of those systems. So becoming a solutionary means that you are going to develop not only critical thinking, but also systems thinking. So you can see these interconnections, and you really truly can make decisions and come up with solutions that have this ethical foundation of doing the most good and the least harm.
And I do want to reiterate what Zoe said. This interview is being recorded about a month before the book comes out, and so she sent me an advanced copy, and I could tell you it's applicable in everything from your family and extended family to your neighborhood to your school system to, wider and wider you go. It's really a method of more thoughtfully pausing when you see a problem and then thinking your way through it instead of following your emotions over a cliff. Would you say that's true?
Yes, I mean, it's a process, right? The reason why I wrote a book is because being a solutionary isn't as simple as just saying, "Oh, that sounds good. I'm a solutionary." It requires deep investigation because of our complex systems, and because there's so much misinformation and disinformation. It requires being willing to do research to find out what's true, to talk to a variety of stakeholders so that you really can understand these very complex situations, and then come up with a solutionary solution, meaning one that really addresses the root or the systemic causes and really does the most good and the least harm. And
You know,
that's
go ahead.
that's a process.
That is process. That that's what it is. We've
Yeah.
got I feel like maybe in our list of complaints about the world, we should add a lack of process because we are just following these
Mm,
knee-jerk reactions. We're accepting, you know, sound bites that are less
mhm.
than 15 seconds as the God's truth, and
Yeah,
we're acting on these things.
totally. Yeah.
And we can teach children. I was fascinated by the work that you guys are doing from the minute I learned about it. From the minute I learned about it, and then just did a tiny deep dive into what you were going proposing we teach children. You know, instead of facts, teach them ways of getting along together, ways of coming up with ideas and celebrating diversity through that collaboration. Like on and on it goes. But I think there's something that probably trips us up, and that may be contempt, Zoe.
Mm.
Because I think most of us, when we recognize a problem, whether it's with our 14-year-old or our mother in law or the neighbor or our principal or whatever, it's contempt. We start out with a contemptuous mindset instead of a solutionary mindset. And you can't
Mm.
almost get anywhere from contempt. And what I see you doing is helping us change contempt to curiosity.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. I like that idea. I would say that this solutionary mindset, it's difficult because I think we bring a number of mindsets and contempt may be one for some people. I think a very common mindset that we have and that's cultivated in our society, that I think we have innately, and then it's further cultivated in the political sphere and in the media, is either or thinking, binary thinking, and side taking. And so when you are thinking in terms of us and them, I think that can for sure lead to contempt. And it can also just lead to a dismissal because you have stereotyped another group, you've generalized about another group as if there are two groups. And the co-founder of the Institute for Humane Education, her name is Ray Sikora, and she and I co-founded the organization back in 1996, 39 years ago. And actually, this is airing on June 26th. Is that
Oh,
correct?
yes.
Because that is the day 39 years ago that we started this organization. At any rate, she once said, when you think of us and them, make sure that you write it down in pencil because you're probably going to need an eraser. So we're always, shifting what is us and them, but this concept of us and them doesn't tend to go away. And when we have an us and them mindset, that impedes a solutionary mindset, because a solutionary mindset is willing to hear a variety of perspectives, wants the nuance, wants to hear from stakeholders who are impacted by problems and who benefit from the problems and the systems that perpetuate them. And somebody's always benefiting, right? Like these problems don't occur without somebody benefiting. And so it's really important to understand all of these factors and then say, okay, we can solve this. And that's where the solutionary mindset comes in. We can solve this instead of we're going to fight about it, we're going to debate it, we're going to argue about it, which is the typical approach both in our politics and our media.
So here's another little bit in the solutionary way that I've thought about. I'm thinking almost every day in some way I've thought about this quote from the book since reading it. You say, strive to be a campfire, not a forest fire. We got to pause on that. Back to the contempt, back to
Yeah.
the way we follow our emotions over a cliff when something strikes us as wrong or unjust or whatever. When we act like a forest fire and not a campfire, we are not attracting people to our ideas or inviting them into collaboration, right?
Yeah, and here's the catch 22. When you have fire in the belly, and I'm using that word fire because this metaphor is really profound of fire, it's very hard for many of us, including me, to hold back on wanting to make sure everybody understands how terrible this thing is. I mean, this is not something new, right? We've seen the passion of activists trying to change things and the anger and rage that people feel, along with sorrow about terrible atrocities and destruction of our beautiful planet. So here's the thing that I write about this metaphor of a campfire. So if you imagine a campfire, it's warm, it's inviting, everybody wants to be around it, everybody's faces are glowing, people are coming more and more and more, and we're basking in the glow of this wonderful campfire. If the campfire gets too hot, if there's too much fuel put on the campfire, there's the chance that sparks will fly and it will ignite an inferno, and we might have a forest fire. Now, what happens when you have a forest fire? Everyone flees. Everyone is choking. Everyone wants to get away and can't get away fast enough. So what is this fuel that I'm talking about? So the fuel is often learning about atrocities and destruction. And the more that we add fuel by learning about these terrible things that are happening, the greater the chance that we are going to turn into a forest fire. And we are going to actually push people away from us because we're burning too hot. And that doesn't mean that we stop adding any fuel, right? Then our fire's burned out and nobody's around us. We don't have a campfire at all. We have nothing. That could be burnout if we've exposed ourselves too much. So it's really a matter of adding the right fuel. And that means we have to expose ourselves not just to the atrocities, but to what you're doing in the goodness exchange, to the good that is happening, so that we can feel hopeful and part of a community that is making a difference. And we can have that kind of fuel, that kind of energy where we draw people toward us. So I am always struggling with this personally. And I think that anybody who wants to create change, it's worth having these metaphors in your mind. How can I be a campfire? How can I burn just right? Not burn out, not burn too hot.
So now this is the third set of goosebumps you've given me. You are so right about that. And I know that personally. I bet you there's not a person listening to this interview that doesn't know those moments when they cross the line, when they just burn too hot for others and others left the scene or stopped working with them or whatever, stopped following them. Oh gosh, you are so right. So there is this perfect balance. Okay, so we are going to take a break, and when we come back, I want you to introduce us to the 4 rules that improv comedy taught you. I'm telling you, Zoe Weil has a story and a background that has made her perfectly suited to lead this movement. And let's take a break, and we're going to come back and hear some more about that. You know how the constant negative noise in our digital lives feels like it's reaching a boiling point? Now, many of us have tuned out the news and social media almost entirely. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. There are newsworthy stories about amazing progress, innovation, leaps in human potential, and wonders in the natural world, and they're just not reaching the top of our feeds. We can have access to this, but none of us has the time or maybe even the emotional stamina to search through all the doom and gloom news to find what's right with the world. Okay, enter the Goodness Exchange. There, we are giving instant access to positive news for curious people. Did you hear about the recent Harvard study that found that exposure to just 4 minutes of good news can make you 32% less anxious and 18% more optimistic? Well, I don't know about you, but I need those kind of numbers in my life. So if you want to live with more joy and way less fear, it's really simple. First, you join us at the Goodness Exchange. Everyone around the world has the opportunity to access this kind of content. And we've promised no politics for about a decade, so you're safe from all that distraction as well. Second, you allow this new, more positive, balanced worldview to put a spring in your step again. It can change the way you react to your kids, your coworkers, everybody you come in contact with. And the stories we write about can make you the idea person in your circles. These challenging times call for us to wake up and take control of our perspective. The people who use the goodness exchange have the ability to react to the harshness of the world much different because they know way more about what's right with the world. And that's a resource. So subscribe to the Goodness Exchange, our YouTube channel and the podcast, and use this content to live a more expansive worldview. It is still an amazing world out there, and you can be a part of it. Welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness. Okay, we're back with Zoe Weil leading the charge with something called the Solutionary Way. From my perspective, it's a way that we can all be transformed as individuals so that we can transform our lives and our communities to get to a better world for everyone. And that's one of the top parts of the concern here for Zoe is that very often people go off on charges that don't really consider the big picture. And so, Zoe, you have learned something from improv comedy, 4 rules that help us find the right fit for our energies when we want to cause change. Talk to us about the improv comedy rules.
Sure. So, even though I live in rural Maine, which is far from the centers of comedy like New York and Chicago and LA, we have this couple who are Second City trained improvisers, and they moved here and they have been performing and teaching. And I've been taking classes with them for a long time. And they taught these 4 rules of improv comedy that I quickly realized were completely applicable to life in general and specifically to being a solutionary. So the first rule of improv comedy is to build relationships. So you imagine 2 people coming on stage and they're going to create a scene. And maybe one of them says to the other one, "Hey, mom, I just entered us into the parent-child acrobatic competition at school." So mom, in the role of mom, responds, "That's great, Brian. We can wear the pink polka dot leotards that I purchased on eBay." Okay, so what happened just then? What happened is that a relationship was established immediately. One of the actors said, "Mom," the other actor said, "Brian." We've got a relationship. If we don't establish relationships, we are going to be hard pressed to solve problems. Now, here's the thing. If you get on stage with somebody, they could say something you don't agree with, you don't like, you don't get, you don't really want to go down that path. But if you're an improv comedian, you have to. You have to accept that relationship and then build that relationship. And the same thing is true if we want to solve problems. There are going to be people we can't relate to, we don't agree with, we might not like what they say. But if we are not willing to establish a relationship, then we are not able to do what needs to be done with that person in order to create change. So this first rule of improv comedy is essential to all of the other ones, and that's why it's the first rule. The second rule is embracing yes and. So when Brian said, "Mom, I entered us into the parent-child acrobatic competition," Mom immediately accepted that role. She said yes to being in the role of mom. And then she added to it by talking about the pink polka dot leotards. That was the and. So if that actor had said, "What are you talking about? I'm not your mother and I don't do acrobatics," the scene would have crashed. There'd be nowhere to go. So yes and is when we find a place where we can agree and we add to it. Now, I realize that yes and is really challenging when we have serious disagreements. So, for example, I'm somebody who is pro-choice. I have friends who are pro-life. Where can we find a yes that we can agree on so that we can maybe find an and? Well, you know what? We can both agree that it would be good if as few girls and women had unwanted pregnancies as possible. We can absolutely agree on that. What are the ands? It's not going to be easy, but can we find any ands? I have influenced people who are pro-life to be willing to accept and support Plan B, the morning after pill. because they see that as a way forward, even though I know it's not going to work for everybody who's pro-life, who thinks that, life begins at conception no matter what. So all I'm saying is that if you can find that point of agreement, there is the possibility of finding ways forward to maybe collaborate, maybe build bridges, maybe not hate each other, maybe not fight each other, just little steps. So that's yes and. The third improv rule is to bring the love. So what do I mean by bring the love? Well, in terms of improv comedy, arguments don't tend to be particularly funny on stage. So improv comedians just avoid arguments and they focus on bringing love. I mean, there are a few comedians who can make arguments funny, like Larry David, but most really can't. And so, how can we bring the love in real life? Well, that also seems like, oh, so Pollyannish and so simplistic, like bringing the love, that sounds all nicey nice. But the reality is that bringing the love is really hard work, really hard. So picture yourself driving in some traffic to work, you're commuting, and all around you are people driving next to you. Nobody's hitting anybody. There's no accidents. Everybody is following the rules and everybody's driving well. Do you experience love for all these people around you? Probably not. I can't even imagine the person thinking like, oh, thumbs up, love you, great job. But as soon as somebody cuts you off, oh my gosh, you're laying on the horn. You're just filled with like immediate rage. Like rage comes so fast. Love can be really hard. And I'll give you a personal example that happened a couple of years ago. So right after Putin invaded Ukraine, and I was consuming all of the news about that, and I was deeply distraught. I had gone for a walk with my husband on a hike in Acadia National Park, which is near where we live. And when we got back to the parking lot, and I heard some people speaking Russian, which is a language I've studied, a language I love. We spent many years trying to adopt a boy from Russia. We were never able to get him out of Russia, but I love him to this day. And so there were these people speaking Russian. And I suddenly felt a wave of adrenaline. I was so angry. I'm thinking to myself, what are you doing here? Walking, like taking a leisurely walk while your president has just invaded this country. Why aren't you working? Like, how can you not be doing anything else but working to stop this? And I'm filled with all these thoughts. I mean, I don't even know if they're Russian. Plenty of Ukrainians speak Russian. Like they might not have been Russians, but I'm filled with all these thoughts and feelings and anger, so sudden. And then one of them happened to come up to me because we'd just done this hike and they wanted to know some information about the hike and asked me some questions. And I just took a deep breath. I was incredibly friendly and nice and loving. I brought the love. I hadn't been feeling it initially. I brought the love. And then later I'm reflecting on this thinking, what did that anger serve? Nobody. It didn't serve me. It didn't serve them. It was based on assumptions and judgments that hadn't been validated. It could have burnt bridges instead of built them. So bringing the love, it's fairly easy for improv comedians because they're trying to do that. In real life, we know that not everybody's trying to do it. Like, look at the tweet that just came through. Not the person wasn't trying to bring the love. Like all of our anger and hostility, like that gets the follows and the reshares and all of that. So bringing the love, my goodness, it takes work. Can I tell you one more example?
Absolutely. I love examples.
Okay. So I recently wrote a blog post on teen anxiety and depression, which, as many people know, is on the rise. It's reaching epidemic proportions. And I wrote about how learning to be a solutionary was an antidote to this. It was really helping young people as they learn to be solutionaries, that despair and that anxiety diminishes. So I wrote this article and it was published in an online news source. And there was the first comment basically just said the word solutionary is so stupid and he couldn't even read any further. And it was just very dismissive and angry and hostile. Now, I could have ignored it. And I decided, I'm going to bring the love. I'm going to bring it so hard. So I shared with him that, about 10% of the people we actually did a survey, and about 10% of people really don't like this word solutionary. They do think it's kind of dumb and, why do we use it? A lot more people like it than don't like it. And I told him I'm one of those people who likes it. But that I really thought that if he read the article and he could get beyond the word, he might see some value in what the concept was trying to do. So he reads the article and he messages back, and we have a back and forth, and I'm just bringing more and more love, as much love as I can bring. And by the end, he apologized and he was on board with, not the word, he didn't like the word, but he was on board with the effort. And yes, that takes time, it takes energy, but I got to tell you, I was on cloud nine afterwards. The fact that I could meet hostility with love, it felt to me like I was doing a spiritual practice for myself, really made me feel better. And obviously it made everything better. So and we have one more, we have one more improv rule, and that is to help others shine. So by that's what you're doing, right? You are shining the light on the good things that are happening in the world. You shine the light on what is good, and then you amplify it. And in amplifying it, then there's a greater chance it will be replicated and used and shared. And that just benefits everybody. So if we can take ourselves out of the spotlight a little bit and amplify the efforts wherever we see them, it's a humbling, and it ultimately brings about a better world.
It's just lovely. Okay. So, folks know on the Goodness Exchange YouTube channel, there will be an excerpt of what Zoe just shared with us, an excerpt from this interview. We'll cut it down to about 9 minutes. And I think it's a little course, Zoe. It's a little mini course. That's what we call them, in ways to just get through the day. Then I suppose often enough, like you just talked about it, right? Like you were even surprised at yourself how it worked and how you stayed with it and bringing the love and so forth, right? I
Yep.
mean, this is a transformational thing that you've just shared with us in 9 minutes. So folks can go to the YouTube Goodness Exchange YouTube channel and look this up and get straight to that point. And I'll be delighted to be able to share that with more and more people, myself, all the time. Okay. So once you kind of walk us through that, you've got me excited. You got me going, okay. Tell me what I got to do next. So you have this great 3 steps that you break it into, how to become a solutionary. Talk to me about those 3 questions that you need to ask yourself, because that also blew me away.
Yeah. So these 3 questions, I mean, they're life questions, and so they're good for anything that you may want to do in your life, but they really help for being a solutionary. So the first question to ask yourself is, what issues in the world do I care about, or in my community, or in my family do I care about? What problems do I want to solve? That's your first question. Your next question is, what am I good at? And your third question is, what do I love to do? So if we can find the place where the answers to question 2 and 3 can be applied to question 1, and that all can meet, our life is kind of golden, right? Like we're doing what we love, what we're good at, in service of what we care about. That's sort of the most perfect, meaningful life I can imagine. And, you know, often when there's a problem that we care about, we're often given models for what we can do about it. So maybe the model is that we're going to go out and protest, or the model is that we're going to call our legislator. And protesting can be something we do. Contacting our legislators it's an easy thing any of us can do. It takes 2 minutes. We should all do it, but it shouldn't be the only thing we do, right? So they're finding the
Can I
ways.
just interrupt?
Yeah,
You're gonna have to address the fact that most people think that adding something to Facebook or a social media post that's irate or just
right.
the forest fire kind of mentality. A lot of people think that's doing something.
Yes, that's a really, really good point. And then you can feel like I did something because I just shared this angry post. So here's the thing. There are so many ways that we can create change and that we need to create change. We need new policies to create new change. We need new laws to create new change. We need innovations, like actual, like people inventing things to create change. We need education to create change. There's so many ways we can create change. And for me, there are a lot of issues that I care about. When I was in high school, I was really I'm a second wave feminist. I just could not believe the kinds of sexism that persisted, and we've come a long way since then. There's still some issues, but I was really concerned about those issues. Then I found out about how animals were treated in our food systems and for product testing and a whole bunch of other things and trapping and fur and I became really passionate about wanting to end animal cruelty. And I also became really, really focused in high school when I was learning about just the horrors, not just of slavery, but of Jim Crow and of the structural racism that persisted even when I was born. I mean, when I was born, it was still illegal in certain states for Black and white people to get married, and those structures of racism persist to this day. And that was a big issue that I was concerned about. So all of these different issues that I was concerned about. How could I address them all? And what was I good at? Well, I remember like hearing about a protest and also about some leafleting opportunities. And so I went to the protests and I also leafleted. And there I was on a Philadelphia street corner. I was handing out my leaflets. People sometimes would scoff. People would just walk by. They wouldn't take my leaflet. That made me mad. Like, why don't you want to learn? Some people would take the leaflet and then like 100 steps later, they'd drop the leaflet and there they would be littering. That made me even more mad. I was like, this is not the best use of my skills, my talents, my time, and I didn't like it. And I wasn't going to last if that was the kind of change making that I had to do for the rest of my life because somebody said, this is what you do. You leaflet and you protest. So around the same time, I was looking for a summer job. I found this program that offered week-long courses to middle school students. I taught a course on animal issues. I taught a course on environmental issues. The kids were utterly transformed in a week. One boy actually went home one day and made his own homemade leaflets, came back and handed them out on a different Philadelphia street corner. But he really wanted to do that. That was his idea. I hadn't told him to do that. And so he found what worked for him. And that summer, I found what worked for me, which was education. So I realized that writing and teaching was what I was good at. I loved it and I could contribute. So that's my solutionary way. So the question for anybody who's listening or watching is, what's your solutionary way? What are you good at? What do you love to do? What issues do you care about? Put it all together. Do that work because your life will be so deeply enriched as you make a difference.
All right. So, okay, let's just review them again.
What do you care about? What problems do you want to solve? What are you good at? What do you love to do?
Okay. So there is a problem of wanting to do too much, which you kind of talked about, right? For instance. So my husband and I are trying to be very active in our little town governance in Vermont. We have a nice little Vermont town, teeny tiny, 2,000 people, and we're showing up for every select board meeting and every zoning board meeting and putting in our 2 cents in a super nice way. We're volunteering for everything. And I volunteered to be sort of the equivalent of our road commissioner. Not our road commissioner. That's not the title, but I'm supposed to be acquiring money and funds and helping the town pay for road and bridge problems that need to be paid for. Well, I don't know. Maybe I just got caught up one night at a select board meeting and they were begging and pleading for someone to take this role. And there I found myself raising my hand. Now, I'm having a fine time of it. I'm going to do some good. But I have learned that the way roads and bridges get paid for in Vermont is completely backwards. So the other day I said, that's it. I'm going to fundamentally shift the way we pay for bridges and roads in Vermont. Well, that's stupid. For the reasons that you're describing. I don't have any particular expertise in roads and bridges. It's not something I really, really, really care about. I might be able to move the needle a tiny bit, but it just doesn't fit your three questions.
Yep.
And
Yep.
so I think we sometimes, from good intention and, like hopefulness, can get drawn into things that aren't as fulfilling. They may be doing some good, but they aren't as fulfilling. And sometimes they become even more weird and complex in our lives. That's why I love the value of those three questions, though, because if I walk around applying those to all the times I want to dive into something or weigh in or whatever, I'll be much better at what I am good at.
Yes. And you brought up another piece of this, which is making sure that you don't bite off a bigger problem than you can chew. And so, we work with young people, and many of them are concerned about issues like climate change, huge problem, poverty, huge problem, animal cruelty, huge problem. These big, big monolithic problems.
Gaza
And
and Israel.
yes.
I mean,
a-
that's in the news right now. Gosh knows what'll be in the news in a month by the time or two before this comes out, right? It's
right.
always something
Yeah.
way
And
bigger than us.
And what can a fifth grader do in terms of these big issues? So, what we encourage people to do is to narrow down that big problem they care about into something local and a feasible problem for them to address. And as they gain more and more skills as a solutionary, they'll be able to take on broader issues and problems and expand their work. Now, I say this as somebody who uh, decided, well, I'm just going to take on all the problems anyway, but I'm doing it through a very specific strategy of education and preparing people to be solutionaries. So if you, Linda, say to me, so what's your solution for what's happening in Israel and Gaza? I'm not going to have a solution for you. If you say to me, what's your solution to end climate change? I'm not going to have a solution for you. What I have is a focus on the educational system and providing the, this process, this framework, this way of thinking, so that some other group that is focused on that issue will be able to solve it. So I'm working on solving the education system. What issue could you solve? Now, if there's a big issue like war, what is that fifth grader going to do? Or for that matter, that 12th grader or that college student? Well, maybe they're going to look at conflict and violence in their sphere of influence. How could they address conflict and violence and gain some skills and knowledge that could then actually have a bigger impact in a wider sphere? Now, I'm not suggesting that it's not a good idea for young people to take on really big problems. I mean, the kids at Parkland, a couple of them decided we're going to take on the problem of gun violence in our society, and many of them are doing profound work.
Profound, right?
For many of us, starting small is a very helpful and sometimes necessary step to getting to the point where we can have far-reaching impacts.
That's something I've noticed in the world of innovators and folks that have ideas but aren't actually acting on them. I get approached a lot about interviewing for this podcast folks that have big fresh ideas but they actually aren't in practice yet. And
Yeah.
I always, pause and I wait till somebody's got some practiced, you know, thought processes and outcomes coming and going before we start celebrating a great idea, because the devil is in the
Yeah.
details. And very often this background research that you're insisting we must do before we proclaim anything or become zealous, I love that thought that you're asking us to do our homework. The world's gotten away from doing homework before we get zealous and start
Yeah.
proclaiming things, but that's another conversation. So let's say we're right here in this moment of, gosh, things are terrible, and I'm always running around saying, well, they're better than you think, because we're just not hearing about all these great people. Talk to us about this concept of bad and better at the same time, Zoe.
Well, in a way, that Jonathan Safran Foer quote at the beginning of the book, we are the flood and we are the ark, is, a precursor to thinking that things can be bad and better at the same time. So, I just mentioned that when I was born, there were laws that in states where Black and white people couldn't get married. Well, there was also 50% of the world population was living in extreme poverty. Now that's below 10%. When I was born, smog and soot coated US cities, New York City, where I grew up, and now the air is cleaner. There were fires breaking out on rivers and lakes, and now many of our waterways are cleaner. Why? Because we
On
passed.
rivers. I think
Yeah.
young people don't know
Yeah.
that back back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and some into the 80s, there were actually video of water burning because
Yeah.
our waterways were so polluted.
Yeah. And we had no laws to prevent
Yeah.
industrial chemicals and raw sewage from entering our waterways. So we passed the Clean Air Act, we passed the Clean Water Act, and those things have improved. When I was a child, most women were not aspiring to careers beyond secretarial work, nursing, and teaching. Now more girls go to college than boys, and around the globe, the vast majority of girls go to school. And, LGBTQ rights were not even on the radar. I mean, nobody was talking about marriage equality back then. So I've seen a lot of positive changes happen in my lifetime. Now we know that those are better. And there's a lot of problems still to solve. And some of them have become far more potentially catastrophic. And, the air in many other places in the world is vastly more polluted right now. And we still have 700 million people who don't have access to adequate food or clean water. And there are tons of problems, which is all to say things can be bad and better at the same time. And if they can be better, they can be better still. So we need to remember that. It's so important, because if we forget that there have been improvements, we can just think that everything's as bad as it's ever been. There's no hope. And we have these, as I just referred to, these escalating rates of youth anxiety and depression. We have the capacity to educate young people to be solutionaries, and we have the capacity for all of us to be solutionaries and to solve these problems. And, I'll just say, to sort of close the loop on that we have students who across the globe are learning to be solutionaries, and we surveyed students from 5 different countries who did solutionary projects last year, and 96% said that they had more compassion and appreciation for others' perspectives and lives. 92% that they said they liked working on a real world problem. Like, this was elevating their lives. And about 6 years ago, no, exactly 6 years ago, we piloted a solutionary program in our home state of Maine, and we just interviewed some of those students who were in that pilot. They were 6th graders then, they're now 12th graders. And they're talking about, they remembered that it was transformational for them. It set them on a new path. I mean, it was profound for these kids. And now we have just started working with the Maine Department of Education. We're going to be educating 200 Maine teachers in the coming months to bring solutionary work and solutionary learning to students in every county in our state. So rural and urban. We live in a very poor state. This is not a program for privileged kids. This is for everybody. And I guess this is my way of saying that things can be better.
Things can be better. Oh, you just gave me goosebumps 3 times. I'm telling you.
That's my goal, Linda. Give Linda goosebumps.
It's a sign. Sometimes I'm keeping hash marks when I'm talking to my guests. You would have 7 now.
Oh, good.
Okay.
If it's a competition, I want to make sure I win by the end of the podcast.
Well, I'm not kidding. I use it as a sign, and I recommend that other people do too. When you meet a thought leader like Zoe Weil or an idea person, no matter how big the scope of their ideas are or how small, it's so It's it's so transformational just to know you exist in the world and people like you. So I can't thank you enough for the bottom of my heart. I For our world. I was so excited when I heard about the Maine schools. Oh, so a lot of people, to a point you just made, a lot of people think that it's not even worth starting if we can't make a touchdown for somebody else or something. But it's always been the person. The game is always won by the guy who helps to get a yard there, or 5 yards there, or a few inches.
Yep.
Sometimes if you can just move the ball a few inches in a few sports, you win the game. I mean, and the the impact of what one person can do to start a ball rolling, or
Hmm.
to get it over the finish line, or to add just their amount of weight, which might have been the triggering amount of public interest that gets a politician to change their mind or whatever. It's a big thing that we all feel like we can be a part of a better future. My experience tells me after 10 years that that's exactly what you're amplifying, is you're giving us a method, a process to develop this in ourselves. Okay. So I'm just going to let people know the book's called The Solutionary Way. There's things we didn't even get to. There's the MOGO. Do you call it the MOGO or Mojo
Mogo.
principle?
Yeah,
MOGO
MOGO just
principle?
stands, yeah, just stands for most good least harm, which we talked
Oh,
about. Yeah.
yes. And there's the 10 instincts. There's so much in this book that it would take a whole nother another episode to share. But I want to wrap up with this notion of, what do you really wish people knew? I always wrap up and talk about, if this had been only 3 minutes, so and knowing what you know and having lived the life that you live, what do you really wish people knew?
A better world is possible. You matter. Become a solutionary.
That's it. That's pretty much all we need. Okay. And that brings us to, how can people get in touch with you? I'm sure that you've put some contact information and some uh, directions in the book, but until then or after then, what's the best way people can get a hold of you?
So my email is zoe@humaneeducation.org, but come to our website and see what we do, which it's just humaneeducation.org. And we didn't really talk about humane education, but it's education about the interconnected issues of human rights and environmental sustainability and animal protection, so we can create a world where everyone can thrive. It's that simple and that complex. It's a big job.
We talked about this much about the mental health aspect of the solutionary way. But I'm telling you, one of the times I got goosebumps, both every time I've ever talked to you, I get goosebumps when I can appreciate the fact that young people are craving this kind of agency over their lives.
Yep.
They're craving the tools to do something important, and to be important, and to have an impact, and to be able to acknowledge, or even just self-aware. And that's one of the things I've loved most about what you've done with the solutionary way in your schools part of this equation. Talk to us just a little bit more before we wrap up about what you see as where the solutionary way can help all of us with our mental health.
So the book's subtitle is Transform Your Life, Your Community, and the World for the Better. And it starts with your life. And the reality is that when we become solutionaries, we cannot help but become surrounded by other solutionaries, because it's a collaborative process. And in that process, we build deepening friendships, relationships, and we have a greater sense of agency and efficacy in the world. We get meaning and purpose. Like, these are all things that enrich our lives so much. And what a win-win that in that process, we're also solving problems that need solving. So this is never an either or. This is not about sacrificing your life for the greater good. No, it's no sacrifice. It is a gift. It is a gift to be able to contribute positively, because it improves your life.
Right. And of course, children pick up on that instantly. What has to happen next? What do you need to have happen? This is so important. We've had guests that have had, transformational things happen in their projects once I've asked that question and the guest tells us honestly what has to happen next? What do you need?
So I would say there's two things. One, I think it's so important. Any parents on this call, any grandparent, I mean, who are listening, any parents, any grandparents, any citizens and teachers, please support this concept of educating a generation of solutionaries. Go to our website, learn about how we can transform education. The whole world rests with this next generation and how they are educated. And if you're able to support our work financially, if you want to help get involved in some other way, we are very grateful for it. So that's number one. And then number two is because we need more solutionaries right now. I just hope that all listeners will get the book and they won't just get it for themselves. They'll get another copy for a business leader or a politician or a friend or an activist who they think could be even more effective in their activism if they just had a solutionary approach. I just hope people will get this book. The more people who read it and implement it, the faster we can solve the problems we face in the
Mm,
world.
and I can think of doing things like, you know, buying this book and giving it to the president of the student council in your high school. Can you
Yep.
imagine learning this at a young age if you already have those tendencies as a young leader? I mean, there
Yes,
are so many ways all of us can engage this process and expand it. And that's the way everything good happens. It's by a small army of really cool people doing what they can to advance a movement.
that's right.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Zoe Weil. You have put a spring in my step today with now eight, eight rounds of goosebumps. Thank you so much for your lifelong interest in just making it a better world, and we will continue to be great partners with you and all that you're doing, as we have for a couple of years now since we first met. It's absolutely a pleasure, Zoe.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, Linda. Thank you for your work and thank you for having me back on your podcast.
Okay, I hope what we brought out this in this conversation puts a spring in your step for the coming week, and you will find all the joy and wonder that Zoe and I have been talking about. Thanks.